Okay, hello everybody and welcome. I'm so happy you're here, and hello to everyone who will be watching it later. We are so thrilled that this evening came about. Liz Weir is normally in Northern Ireland, and so we could not miss the opportunity. She was in this side of the world to have this concert, and we were delighted to have the amazing Willy Claflin to be our MC tonight. So thank you.
Good people, prayed a petition. Your attention we beg and we crave. And if you have in mind for to listen, an abundance of pastime we'll share. We have come to relate many stories concerning our forefathers' time. And whatever the next line is. We're very happy to see you here this evening. One of the interesting things about having storyteller from Ireland here is that, as you may know, storytelling is different across the pond. And the signature anecdote about this is Donald Davis, who most of you know as our premier teller of personal tales, going over to some big festival at the Edge, maybe, I don't know which one it was. And he did his hour-long set about his family in the mountains and all that. And afterwards they came up to him and they said, "It was wonderful. So nice to hear about your family. I wish you'd taken the time to tell us a story." And that's one difference. Another difference is music in storytelling festivals. The division over here in this country between music festivals and storytelling festivals is rigorous and inexplicable, especially since it all comes from sung ballads, way back anyway. It's just really weird. When Pete Seeger came to the National Festival in Jonesboro, they had a dozen letters of complaint. We came to hear stories, not a bunch of folk music. So it's so wonderful to have a normal festival from your point of view and sort of mine too, which will also give me the chance to tell a traditional story. Only my story, oddly enough, and although you probably know I'm breaking Mary Gay's Ducey rule about if you're an MC, you make it as short as possible, but I've been given the role of being an MC in which I'm supposed to first tell a 15-minute story. So the cognitive dissonance in my brain between what my mentor taught me and what I've just been asked to do is excruciating. But I'm trying to learn to shuffle the left and right brain together anyway, and this will prove whether it is a successful experiment. Oddly enough, for 20 years, when I did my annual residency at the Shady Hill School in Cambridge, I taught a 6th grade unit on African folktales. As a good New England wasp, and I would go to them and I would say, might be nice if you had someone with slightly closer ties to the griot tradition here. It's kind of like having Pete Seeger sing Howling Wolf. I mean, this is kind of a strange thing we're doing here. And they say, no, the kids really like you. And so, oddly enough, I wound up teaching African folktales for 20 years to the 6th grade and exploring the themes thereof and all that. In a way, it sort of fit, because when I was a kid, I had a huge scrapbook full of African stuff. I loved the stamps, especially the saturated colors, the crimson and the purple and the cadmium yellow, and the names when I was a kid, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika. And then, of course, there were the animals. And I sort of thought that maybe like Conan Doyle's The Lost World, there might be a plateau somewhere in Africa where all the dinosaurs would still hang out. Anyway, I wound up teaching African folktales. It also went along with what I had gotten into as a kid, because I ran across an old book that my dad had of Anansi stories. And as a mischievous child, the Anansi stories were an utter delight to me. And so the Anansi stories from the Ashanti people became a lifelong addiction. And of all the Anansi stories that I know, I thought I would tell you my personal favorite, which is Anansi and the Liars Contest. This was around the time when my friends were discovering Spider-Man. But I was trying to tell them that it was a different Spider-Man, and I could not manage to translate that. Anyway, once upon a time, Anansi was walking through the forest, and he's paying no attention to where he was going. He was thinking about yams. If you could have seen the thought balloon over Anansi's head, it was full of yams, all kind of yam dishes. There were baked yams and boiled yams and fried yams. And he was thinking about yams and walking along, and paying absolutely no attention to where he was going. And all of a sudden, from out behind a rock, fly and moth and mosquito jumped out and started beating on him. And it was very clear they were trying to kill him. So Emcee fought back as hard as he could, and after about an hour of fighting, they all just collapsed. They realized no one was going to get the upper hand. They were all exhausted, and they just collapsed in the dust. And Emcee said, "What was that all about?" And Moth said, "Well, we were hungry, and we saw you coming along, and we thought we'd knock you down and kill you and eat you." "Well," said Emcee, "it's a much better idea. I think I'll just knock you down and kill you and eat you." And Fly said, "Yeah, but you can't do that. We can't kill you. You can't kill us. We're going to have to go hungry," which is about the worst thing Emcee could think of, was going hungry, being Emcee and all that. And he said, no, let's have a contest, and whoever wins the contest gets to eat the other side. And Moth said, "You mean like me and Fly and Mosquito are one side and you're the other?" "Yeah," said Emcee. "So here's how the contest, it's going to be a liar's contest. Here's how it's going to work. Pay attention. Everybody gets to tell a story. And if you think that the story someone else tells is a lie, you have to say, 'That's a lie.' And if you say, 'That's a lie,' they get to eat you." Moth said, "Okay, I think. I mean, so if I tell the story and you think it's a lie, you have to say it's a lie. And if you say it's a lie, I get to eat you." "Yes," said Emcee. Mosquito said, "Well, it seems to me it's going to make a pretty big difference who goes first." And Emcee said, "I do not care who goes first. It makes no difference to me whatsoever. Go ahead." Moth said, "Okay, Emcee, well, I was, it happened before I was born. My dad was clearing the field with his machete. And every year we have to clear the field, and we have to plant, and we have to raise the crops, and we have to take them down to the market. And that's how we get through the year. That's how we get food and money, and that's how we make a living. But he cut his foot really badly. He cut his foot so badly, he almost chopped it off, and he almost lost his foot. Luckily, he didn't, but he had to come back in. It took weeks, months for his foot to heal. And so there was no one to clear the field and no one to plant the crops. And we were going to starve to death. And I thought, well, the least I could do, having been conceived, was to go do this for them. So even though I hadn't been born yet, I went out and I cleared the field and I planted the crops. And even though midsummer, I still hadn't been born yet, I went out and tended the crops and I watered them and I weeded them. And when fall came, it was almost time for me to be born, but not quite yet. And Dad's foot wasn't quite healed. And so I went out and I harvested the crops and I took them down to market and sold them. And I brought them back home and looked at Emcee. His mouth watering already. Emcee said, "Boy, I am so ashamed." Moth said, what are you ashamed about, Emcee?" Emcee said, "I never did anything for my folks before I was born. Was so selfish at that time in my life. I'm just so moved by what you would do for your parents before you were born. And that's a beautiful, beautiful story." And Moth said, "You don't think it's a lie?" Emcee said, "No. Are you telling me it's a lie?" "No," said Moth. No. Well, then it was Mosquito's turn. Mosquito said, "Okay, Emcee, I shot Lion, and the bullet was taking a long time to get there. And I was in a hurry, so I ran ahead, I caught the bullet, I put it back. No point in wasting ammunition. I killed the lion, but then Hyena came up, and Hyena wanted to steal my kill, and I couldn't let that happen. So I tried to figure out what to do. Hyena is a lot bigger than I am. So I said the most repulsive, obscene thing I could think of about his grandmother. The hyena was furious, and he opened his mouth wide to roar, and that was the opening that I needed. I flew straight into his mouth, down his throat, through his stomach, out to his tail, and I pulled him inside out. And luckily, he had just swallowed a sheep whole. And now the sheep was on the outside, and the hyena was on the inside of the sheep. And I got to ride the sheep home. And he looked at Emcee, and Emcee said, "Well, not only am I ashamed about not having been a dutiful son, but I thought I was a fine hunter. It's clear to me, I never managed to catch up with one of my own bullets. And you guys are just putting me to shame." Mosquito said, you do believe that?" "Yeah, I do," said Emcee, "and you know why? Because, if you really listen to a teller's voice, if you really listen to them, you can tell when they're telling you the truth. They may be putting you on part of the time, but when they're revealing the deepest truth about themselves, you can hear that sincerity in their voice." Well, then it was Fly's turn. "Okay," said Fly, "I shot elephant, okay? And I didn't want to share my kill, so I cut elephant up into about 1,000 pieces, and I dragged him up in a net to the top of the tree so no one else could get it. And then I was sitting up there in the tree. I thought, how am I going to protect the elephant meat? And I thought, well, I'll just have one bite of elephant meat. But as you probably know, you can't just stop at one bite of elephant meat. You got to have just one more, right? And then you got to have just one more. And before I knew it, I had eaten the entire elephant. Now here I am on the top of the tree, and I thought, like, God, how am I going to get down out of here? I'm huge. I'm going to be stuck here. And then I figured it out. I went back to my village, got a rope, and lowered myself down. And Anansi said, wow, you guys have just put me to shame in every conceivable way. And Fly said, you are not going to tell me you think that's true. Well, of course I am, said Anansi, because it's not just the tone of a storyteller's voice. It's when you look into their eyes and you understand where their story's coming from. It's coming from the heart. It's a true communication. And I could hear it in your voice, and I could see it in your eyes. I saw it in your eyes. It was the light of truth. And since you have 100 eyes, there was a lot of light of truth coming out. And, well, you got 99 eyes. I'm sorry about that one there, but you have 99 eyes. And, well, anyway, thank you guys so much, because not only are you an inspiration to me, but you spared me having to die. And I want to thank you for telling me true stories. And Moss said, well, it's very funny, Anansi. What's your story? Anansi said, oh, my story. Well, found a coconut, planted the coconut. After about 10, 15 years, a coconut tree grew. There were 3 coconuts up in the top of the tree. I thought, I want to eat the coconut. So I shook the coconut tree. All 3 coconuts fell down to the ground. I thought, I want to eat the sweetest one first. How am I going to know? Got to cut them open. Cut open the first one. And you know what was inside the first one? A moth. I thought, how could a moth get inside a coconut? I thought, well, I don't know, but it's my coconut, so it's my moth. Well, I split open the second one, and there was a mosquito inside the second coconut. I thought, this is really weird. I wonder what's inside the third one. I split it open. There was a fly. There was a moth, a fly, and a mosquito, and they were inside my coconuts. And they were mine, so I was going to eat them first. But just as I was about to eat them, they flew away. And now that I look at you guys, moth, you're the same moth in my coconut. I can tell because there's a little rip by that patch of purple iridescence down on the lower right of your left wing there. And mosquito, you're the same mosquito that was in my coconut because you got a bent stinger. And fly, I can tell you got 99 eyes, and the fly in my coconut had 99 eyes. And you guys belong to me. You already stole yourselves away, and now I get to eat you because you belong to me. And Moth was trying to say, that's a lie, but of course Fly stopped him. He said, you cannot say that's a lie or he gets to eat us. I know, said Moth, but if it's true, he gets to eat us. What are we going to do? So Fly said, well, how did Anansi's story? Oh, it ended with him flying away. Here we go, zoop, and they all flew away. Well, poor Anansi. He got to his feet, all of them, and he set off through the forest again, thinking about yams, thinking about how the next fly, moth, and mosquito he found, he certainly would do his best to kill. And moth, fly, and mosquito did something very important. They listened to the whole story, all the way through to the end. And not only did they solve their own problem, but they solved the problem in Anansi's story by escaping alive and by ending this story, which they did, and now it's done. So is that. Okay. Am I supposed to be louder? Oh, okay, okay, very good. Kenny, whom I will now introduce, since he's already been up here, now I get to introduce him. Kenny Somerville, I was telling him before the program that about 20 years ago, I'd gone to a program somewhere and heard this wonderful group, the Gas Men, playing, and somebody had, I remember, it asked me at the time, what was the music like? And I said it was like kind of like Celtic bluegrass. It was this amazing thing. And when I started to ask around about Kenny, I found out that he is a member of the Gas Men. And in fact, I had heard him play the mandolin 20 years ago without having any idea who he was. Since then, because we live in a wonderful world now, there's a wonderful clip online of Kenny reciting 2 beautiful poems the long arc, and singing "My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose." And I don't know what he's going to do now, but I am really looking forward to it. It's great to see you after 20 years. Kenny Somerville.
I think I might sit on the stool because I'm more used to performing from bar stools and the like. Maybe this needs to go down a fraction. There we are. Well, I'm going to tell you a story. And it's a story from my part of the world, which is County Fermanagh. And, well, it was a good night. There was a bit of a moon. And I was just coming from the dance in Bundoran. Now, Bundoran is a little town on the seaside, South Donegal. I was walking, because I didn't own a car at the time. And I was heading home to Balleek, about 8 miles. It's a long walk. But I wasn't too worried because the odds were always that somebody would be coming from the dance and they'd give you a lift. So I trudged on through Bundoran and I heard the sound of a car and I looked over my shoulder. And I could see 2 lights kind of close together and very dim. So I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. But I walked on another bit and the car went past me and pulled over. Very good, says I to myself. And I ran up to the car to catch up. It was one of those old, high black cars, a Ford 8, I later found out. And just I could see through the back window, I could see this big white head leaning over to the passenger door to open it. And the door opened, and I heard the voice, "You might as well get in, young fella." So naturally, I hopped in and thanked him. He says, "Where are you from?" I says, proudly, "I'm from the townland of Fossa." Now, I didn't expect he'd know the townland of Fossa because there's a lot of townlands in even the County Fermanagh. But he says, "Oh," he says, "I know it very well. I can bring you to your own lane." Very good, says I. We drove on another wee bit, and then he swung the wheel, and we drove up a wee by road. He says, "We'll take the back road." I says, "That's good to me." And then we went on another little bit. And he started lilting. Now, you probably know what lilting is. It's kind of where you use your mouth to make the dance music for dancing. It sounded a bit like this. And at the same time, the old Ford 8 was humming away underneath it like. Well, I don't know, some way with the sound of the lilting and the Ford 8, my eyes started to droop. And I must have dozed off because the next thing, I found a kind of a jolt. And I could still hear the old man that was driving the car. He was still lilting away. But there was no sound of the car. Instead, I could hear. Opened my eyes pretty quick then. And I was looking at the hindquarters of a big white horse. And I was sitting in a trap. A trap, I think, is maybe a buggy in American language, but we called it a horse and trap. And I looked over at the old fella, and he gave me a kind of a sly smile. I didn't know what to say to him, so I said nothing. He says, "Are you fond of music?" I says, "Well, I am fond of music." He says, "Will we go to a dance?" I says, "You must be joking. There's going to be no dancing going on at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm only after coming from a dance." "Oh," he says, "young fella, that's where you're mistaken. Maguires of the Hill, they'll only be getting started right now, and they'll be dancing until nearly light." Well, I says, "Surely, we'll go, surely." So we clipped along for another wee bit, and then he pulled the reins, and he brought the horse in a little laneway up a hill. And as we were going up the hill, over the sound of the horse's hooves, I could hear the sound of a fiddle. No, more than one. 2, maybe 3, and a flute. We kept on another wee bit, and then we came round a turn, and there was the house. And the light was streaming out of the kitchen window, and out of the open doorway, and there was about half a dozen or 8 maybe people out on the street outside the house. When we pulled up on the horse and trap, there was a great welcome. Of course, they knew the man who was holding the reins. "All right, Johnny, how you doing? Now the dancing will start. By God, it's good to see you." And then somebody grabbed the reins, tied them up. We got down out of the trap and introductions, a bit of backslapping, handshakes, and we went into the kitchen. The set was going on well at that point, but it was just coming to an end. And the musicians were just playing the last few notes of the turn, and the dancers were getting ready for that big stamp at the end of the set that marks the end of the dance. And then there was tea, what we always called it tea, and fudge bread. That's homemade bread. And there was a wee bottle of poaching going round as well. Poaching is, I think they might call it white lightning or something over here. So the old fella, as I now knew him to be Johnny, old Johnny, I'm going to call him from now on, old Johnny looked over at me and he says, "Do you see them 2 lassies over in the corner?" I says, "I do," and I had, because there was 2 girls over in the corner around my age. I was about 20 at the time, and they were good looking. I says, "I do." He says, "We'll take them out for a dance, the next set." I says, I don't know if I'm that great. He says, "No bother to you. And the one on the right, Margaret, she's a great dancer and she'll keep you right." "All right," says I. Sure, I had to be game. We went over, we chatted them for a while, and then the music started up again. I think it was the Leitrim set. And they started playing, and we got out dancing. Well, lucky enough, Margaret was good, and she was able to keep me from getting in other people's way, at least. But the old fella, old Johnny, he was a master. I never seen the beat of it before or since. And all the people there knew he was a master too, because they were watching him carefully. And the people that were outside came to the door and leaned in round the door jamb to get a look at him. "Go on, Johnny. Boy, you can do it. Good man, Johnny. That's the style." That's what they were at. And that's the way the night went. We stopped for tea a few more times, and there was a few more sets when the wee bottle of poaching made its way around as well. And then eventually, old Johnny looked at me and he says, I suppose I'd better get you home. Didn't you say that you had to get up tomorrow to work at hay?" I said, aye, you're right there. He says, "Well, we better go." So we said our goodbyes to all the dancers, and we got into the trap, and we started clip-clopping down the hill from Weir's on the way home. And then he started lilting again. And of course, you know what happened. Me eyelids drooped, and I dropped off. Until I found a jolt, and he was still lilting. But there was no sound of horses' hooves anymore. There was the sound of the old 4-8. Well, I opened my eyes and looked through the front window, and we were just coming up to my lane. He says, "Thanks very much, young fella. A grand night." I says, "Well, thank you, sir." And he stuck out his hand, and we shook hands. And then he done a funny thing for that time and place. He put his other hand round my hand, and he gripped it, and he shook it tight, and he leaned over closer to me, and he says, I thought I'd never get a chance to meet you." And his voice kind of broke like that. I didn't know what to make of it. So as usual, I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I got out of the car, he went off, and the next thing I remember is my father shouting up the stairs at me in the morning, "Are you going to get up today at all? Or will we just let the hay burn in the field?" Of course, I had to get up. And that was the night. It was a very strange night, and when I look back on it now, I kind of can't make sense of it, but it's sort of interesting. Oh, but there's one other thing. About 2 weeks later, I was talking to a man, Pat McNulty. Now, Pat was well known for knowing the countryside very well and who lived where and who was connected to who. I says, Pat, did you ever hear of Maguires of the Hill? He looked at me. He says, are you codding me? That means, are you making fun of me? Are you codding me? He says, didn't I go there hundreds of times with your grandfather in a horse and trap? Well, he must have seen the strucken look on my face. So he says, sure, you never met him, did you? Didn't he die the year you were born? Well, he must have still noticed I hadn't opened my mouth and my jaw was hanging open or something. But he put it down to the fact that I was sad, that as far as he knew, I'd never had a chance to meet my own grandfather. That's the story. Thanks very much.
What a good idea. Place to sit. Liz Weir, it is so good to see you again. We don't know when it was we last saw one another. 20 years, probably. Cape Clear, maybe Jonesboro, Tennessee, we don't know. And I was saying to Claire earlier, too, that it's been so long and so much time has gone by, and I'm really feeling the fact that I'm not middle-aged anymore. And so I was always passing through my mind, and when my wife Jacqueline said, well, who's helping sponsor this program? I didn't say 6 feet apart. I said, oh, it's that group 6 feet under. Oh, I see. Well, anyway. So this is the Undead Storytelling Festival. We're all pleased to be here. Rumors of our death are greatly exaggerated. One of the things I loved about Liz, well, mostly I just love the stories, of course. There's all the stuff around it, like who she is and what she did and all that. What I remember was that she was perfect at setting a scene and saying what she wanted to say without having to directly say it, especially if it might offend someone. And what I remember, and I hope I don't spoil a story that you're going to tell, I really do, but I remember that she does this setup for this story, and there's this chap, and he's going over the moors at night. He's exhausted. It's cold. It's really late at night. He needs some shelter. And he stumbles upon a farmhouse. And the window is brightly lit. And the husband and wife are there. And he looks in the window, and Liz says, what can I say about her? She was being awfully good to him. That aside, during the Troubles, Liz discovered the power of story, people just listening to each other's stories on both sides. And there's another one of her stories that I have to quickly ask you if you're going to tell. This the short one about the farmer with the 3 sons, and he's going to give the farm to whoever. You going to tell that one tonight? All right, I'll let you do that. There's a story that she's going to tell later. I'll reintroduce her later. That to me was kind of the story version of her life, in that she runs this beautiful hostel on the coast of Antrim, and it's a place you can go and rest, and you can play music, and you can tell stories, and the house is filled with stories and music, and a good place to sleep or not sleep, stay up all night. Please welcome Liz Weir.
You know, I might just sit as well. Is that all right? Hello, people watching in from all over the place. I know you're live here tonight, and that's wonderful. But it's also lovely to have friends. I know Marie's in Chicago and Erin's in Wisconsin, and it's lovely to see you all. So hi there. One of the things that really gladdens my heart is that not only have I friends I haven't seen for years and years, I've also what they call outlaws that are relatives. So my husband's cousin and his wife are here, and it's so lovely they've driven down to be part of it. And we might talk about that later on in a nice way. So I thought I'd start with a story that comes from County Fermanagh, because that's where Kenny's from, and it's a delight to me that Kenny's here. because we got some funding to work cross-border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to train storytellers. And who turned up for the course but Kenny, who spends part of his time in Fermanagh and part of his time here. And when I heard I was coming here, I said, Kenny's over, he can come and share his story. So it's such a delight to watch somebody who's grown his storytelling. He's been a musician for years. Isn't he a great storyteller though, isn't he? Very good storyteller. I can spot them. But this story was told by the late George Sheridan. Now, there's no point in me telling this story unless the audience is intelligent. So you're intelligent, aren't you? Because you have to be ahead of me here. So the story I'm going to tell you takes place in a place called Benbow Mountain. Now, compared to the mountains in the Rockies and so on, it was more like a pimple, a hill. But if you go over to Fermanagh and Leitrim, there's not much high ground. And so Benbow Mountain was the highest place around. And this old man who lived there had an old stone cottage with a thatched roof, and people called him the Lord of Benbow, for he was master of all he surveyed. The old man's cottage was very poor. One room, creepy stool, settled bed, open fire, didn't even have a proper door. It had a sort of a straw mat for a door. He had one son. His wife had died in childbirth, and he reared his son hoping that he would love the land as much as his father, but like many a young fella in his story, the first thing he wanted to do was get away, head off to England, seek his fortune. So at the first opportunity to take a cow to market, he sold the cow, he bought a fine outfit of clothes, he took off to England, little thinking if his father thought him alive or dead. Never gave him a thought. Now, when he went to England, he was a handsome young man, dressed very finely. He was walking about through the countryside, and he saw two big gateposts, and he saw a sweeping driveway and a big gentleman's residence, think Downton Abbey. And he stood there and looked at it and thought, that's the sort of place I should have been born. And as he was looking at it, a voice said, and who might you be? He turned his head, and there was a beautiful young woman, finely dressed, and he said, I am the son of the Lord of Benbow. My father's estates are in Ireland. Oh, she said, my father's a duke. This is our home. Won't you come for tea? Next thing, feet under the table, tea in a china cup, cakes. Oh, he was happy. And he stayed, and he stayed, and he stayed, and the duke realized that his daughter was falling for this handsome young Irishman. And he thought, I need to find out who this boy is. So he went to his library and took down his books, Debrett's Peerage, Burke's Peerage. But of course, you won't be surprised to know no such person as the Lord of Benbow in these books. So he called his servant, he said, go to Ireland, find the Lord of Benbow's castle, report back to me. Now, I could send you over to Fermanagh now, and you'd have a job, wouldn't you? With no public transport, getting to the far reaches of County Fermanagh. And he kept asking people, the Lord of Benbow's castle. And Fermanagh people are very easygoing. Aye, surely, aye. And heading him on. And so finally, late one night, there was just a bit of moonlight. Somebody pointed him up this lane, this boreen, just the width of a cow. Up this lane, they said, oh, the castle. Surely it's up there. So the poor young man was stumbling in the darkness with just a bit of moonlight. And as he came near the top of this lane, he heard this clanking of metal on metal. Heart scared. Two goats butting chains together, butting their heads together, chains rattling. So he skirted round them, and in the moonlight, he saw this thatched cottage with a straw door. And he said, hello, anybody there? And the old man inside pulled back the straw mat, and the moonlight lit the cottage. And the old man, of course, talking for both of them. Oh, you're lost, stranger. Come in, sit yourself down. Come on, you'll not go down there tonight. And the next thing he knew, he was sitting on a stool beside the fire, was given a cup of tea with goat's milk in it. Never tasted anything like it. And the old man said, you'll stay here for the night? And he looked, he only saw the one bed. Where was he going to sleep? But the old man went out and got an armful of rushes and put them down in front of the fire. And that young man had the best night's sleep ever. The next morning when he woke up, the rushes were thrown outside, and he was given a bowl of porridge with goat's milk. Again, he'd never tasted anything quite like that. And then the old man began to ask him questions. Where had he come from? And of course, the minute he said England, The old man started to cry. "Och," he said, "I have a son. I don't know if he's alive or dead. People tell me he's in England." And he started to talk with such love about his son. The young fellow saw what was going on. He knew what was happening. And he smiled to himself. And he thought about how kind the old man was. And he said, "That's why I'm here. I'm here to bring you news of your son. Your son is doing very well. Your son's in England. He's alive. He's well. And it's likely he's going to marry the daughter of a duke. Well." The old man's tears of sadness turned to tears of happiness, and swinging back the straw mat, he led the young man out into the Fermanagh sunlight. There in front of him, he saw beautiful green fields, lovely lakes, and bidding the old man goodbye and thank you, he skirted carefully around the goats and returned home. "Well," said the Duke, "did you find the Lord of Bembow's castle?" "Oh, yes, sir," he said. "The Lord of Bembow's castle is atop the highest fortifiable position in the area, easy to defend. It's guarded by an army so fearsome you can hear their armor before you get near it. The door to his castle, I doubt if there's a carpenter in England would know how to make that. The lamp that lights his room, you, sir, with all your money, could never afford to buy. The food I ate, I doubt if there's a chef in England would know how to prepare that. The bed I slept in, I was the first person to sleep in it, and after me, it was thrown out to be replaced for the next guest. Ah, yes," he said, "I met the Lord of Bembow, and all I can say is that your daughter's really lucky to be marrying the son of such a fine gentleman." Thank you. So that was George. George used to have a three-piece suit, gold watch chain, we have glasses, and he drove me around Fermanagh, stopping and pointing out things. You could have been stopped in the middle of the road and a huge truck would come behind you, beep, 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 but no, George would go on with the story. They're very easy going in Fermanagh, you know. So I hope you like that one, because what I want to do is maybe introduce you to some of the people who've shared their stories with me. The next one, and Willy set it up beautifully, was a man called Harry Scott. Harry was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. He'd been a scout leader. He retired. He sort of lost his audience, and then I brought him out telling stories. And this is the story that I got from him, my favorite story. All these people are gone now, so I feel very responsible for passing on their stories. You probably know that in Ireland, young men and young women were hired out for 6 months at a time. They'd have to stay away from home. They wouldn't get a penny piece if they didn't stay their 6 months hire. And this young man was coming home from his 6 months hire, and it's what we would call a miserly old night. It was rain that didn't seem heavy but would chill you to the bone. And this young man thought, if I could just get a bed for the night, I'll work all day tomorrow. He was coming along a road, and he saw a lane with a light on in the farmhouse, and he headed towards it when he met another young man saying, "Don't go near that house. There's a wicked, bad-tempered woman in that house." And he thought it was a bit late to be facing any wicked, bad-tempered women. So he saw beside the house there a hay shed. He climbed up into the hay shed, and he could see down into the kitchen. And, well, he's quite right, in the kitchen there was a young man, a young woman, and she was being powerful good to him, is all we'll say. There on the table, there was what the young man could see was, it looked like a plate of meat. There was something that looked suspiciously like a bottle of whiskey, and there looked to be a wonderful apple cake. Now, you're asking me how I knew all this, or how he saw this. He was from a place called Altanya, a townland, a local area where the people had great knowledge. All they had to do was think a thing and they could see it. So this young fellow was drooling. His stomach thought his throat was cut. He was so hungry. And as he looked, he heard the noise of cartwheels on gravel, and he saw panic break out in the house. The young woman grabbed the young man she was with and put him in a big barrel beside the fire and put a rug over it. Took the plate of meat, put it down behind a curtain, took the bottle of whiskey and put it behind the couch, and took the apple tart and put it up in the cupboard. And the young fellow from Altanya thought, I know what's going on here. He watched as she stepped to the door and greeted none other than her own husband home. "Oh, John," she said, "I didn't think you'd be home tonight." "No," he said, "I could get no price for the cows. I just came on home." And the young fella thought, now's my chance. So he went down and he knocked on the door, and the farmer came and he said, "Any chance of a bed for the night? I'll work all day tomorrow." "Surely," said the farmer. "Kind man, come in, sit yourself down. Mind you, all there is in this house is potatoes and buttermilk. That's all there is to eat." And the two men started eating. Now here's a tip for if you come to Ireland. Always compliment the potatoes. You have to say they're like wee balls of flour. And so he said this. But he said, "A bit of meat would be lovely with them." "Oh, there's no meat in this house," said the farmer. "Hold on," said the boy. "I can help repay your hospitality. I'm from a place called Altagna. All we have to do is think a thing and we can have it. Let me think. Try just down there. Try down behind that curtain, see what you get." Sure enough, there comes the meat. The two boys eating it and the wife's looking round, wondering what's going on. They're eating it. The young fellow says, "I have an awful sweet tooth in my head. You haven't any home bacon?" "No," said the farmer. "My wife there used to bake, but I don't know what's going wrong. There's something wrong lately. She's not just doing the things she used to do." "Hold on," said the boy. Try up on the top of that cupboard, and sure enough, down comes the apple cake and the two into eating it. The young fellow said, "This is lovely buttermilk, but you wouldn't have anything stronger." "No," said the farmer. "I don't." "Hold on. Try down behind that couch, and sure enough, there comes a bottle of whiskey." Now, ladies and gentlemen, have you ever seen what happens when you get two people meeting over a bottle of whiskey? One of two things happens. Either one, they fight, or in this case, it was all palsy-walsy. You tell me your problems, I'll tell you mine. The farmer had plenty of problems. Things weren't going well with his wife. She wasn't being kind. She wasn't being loving. What could he do? The young fellow said, "I think I can help." He said, "I have it. Now you have to do exactly as I tell you. The devil is in this house." "What?" "The devil's in this house, but I can help." And he took the poker, and he took the tongs, and they pushed them into the heart of the fire. White hot they were. He reached the poker to the farmer. He took the tongs. He pulled the cover off the blanket. In went the poker. In went the tongs. The poor young man hiding in the barrel came out screaming and yelling and out the door like the devil himself. "That should solve your problems," said the young fella. The farmer said, "I don't know how to thank you. Look, come and sleep in the spare bedroom." Up he went. Brass bed, big quilt, bolster pillows. Young fella hunkered down. Great. Next morning when he woke up, he smelt that smell. Well, you have to come to Ireland to experience it. We call it an Ulster fry. An Irish breakfast. Sausages, bacon, potato bread, soda bread, fried egg, black pudding, white pudding. A cholesterol special, a heart attack on a plate. The wife was serving up this breakfast. The young fellow was eating it. And finally the farmer said, "I don't know how to thank you." And he put his hand in his pocket. Moths were flying out because he didn't often put his hand in his pocket. Out came a big white £5 note. That was more than the boy had earned for 6 months. Set it into the young fellow's hand and said, "Thank you very much. Thanks for helping me." The young fellow, smiling, went down the lane. When he got to the foot of the lane, he heard a rustling in the bushes. And up from the bushes like a bird stepped the young wife. Put her hand in her apron pocket, gave him another £5 note and said, "Thanks very much for not telling my husband about me." And that's the story. So that was Harry, who was the elder in the Presbyterian Church. Going to do something a wee bit different now. There have always been stories linking Ireland and the United States. And I want to tell you a special story. I'll tell you why it's special afterwards. But one of the wonderful things about the family I married into is that Dave's mum was a GI bride. And she married the most handsome American soldier and went to live in Monterey, California. And that's where I first went in 1976. So it's a pleasure to be back here in California again. But this story I'm going to tell you comes from way, way, way before that. The time of the Irish famine. 1840s. There was a family in Donegal whose name was O'Connor. There was a father, a mother, a wee boy called Sean, who was about 4, and a baby girl called Kathleen, a wee babe in arms. They lived in one of those cottages owned by the landlord, but of course they couldn't pay the rent. And one morning the landlord's men came and evicted them from the cottage, and as they're standing outside, the mother holding the baby in her arms, she said, wait, I've left something inside. No rent, no house. And they had to go to the workhouse. And you've probably read about these workhouses, terrible places. The men were separated from their wives, the wives from their children. It was very poor conditions. And within a few weeks, the wee baby had died. And at that time, they buried fever victims just in one big grave. The young woman, when she heard the news, got thinner and weaker and died of a broken heart. But her husband made sure she was buried in a churchyard, couldn't afford a stone or anything, but that was it as far as he was concerned. He was leaving Ireland. And he took his little boy by the hand, and they made the long walk up to Derry and got on one of those coffin ships bound for Boston. All the way over, the man told his little boy about his mother, his baby sister. He played him a whistle. He sang songs, told him stories. And when he got to Boston, he was claimed by the Irish community, and of course, he was a good worker. He worked in the building trade, and generation followed generation. Sean, the little boy, grew up and went into the building business. And so as the generations passed, they made a lot of money. But like many, many, many Irish families, they wanted to come back and find their roots. So they came all the way back to Donegal. It was easy to find the graveyard where the great-great-granny was buried, and they got a stone made for the grave. And then they went in search of the cottage. And there it stood, no roof, all fallen in. But there was a for sale sign. They said, we're going to buy that. People said, you can't buy it. It's haunted. What do you mean it's haunted? Every night, a baby cries in that house every night. People can't even walk past it without hearing the baby cry. They said, it's our house. We're going to buy it. So, of course, being builders, they built it. They got a beautiful thatched roof put on it, lovely whitewashed walls, beautiful half-door coloured windowsills and so on. And their daughter, Kate, was playing about in the house before they moved in. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of the old Irish cottages with big, big chimneys that you can actually almost step inside and see the sky. And halfway up the chimney, there was a little hole where you'd keep salt to keep it dry. She knew all this from the stories. She put her hand in, and wasn't there something there? And when she pulled it out, it was an old piece of ragged cloth, and inside, a locket, an old, old locket. When she opened it up, there was just a drawing of a wee baby, and it said, Katie, 1847. And that's what the great-great-granny had wanted to come in for. She knew the story. So she brought it, she showed it to her father. They buried it in the grave with the great-great-granny. And nobody ever heard the crying baby again. I love that story. Now, if I was to tell you that was made up by a group of children, they were 9 years old in a school in Donegal. They created that story. Isn't it lovely for them? I just love it. And all we did was give them, they chose where it was going to happen, what was going to happen, basic storytelling. But I've told that story all over the place. I remember telling it years ago in San Diego. And I just love it as an example of a story, a new story. But sure, if I hadn't told you that, you'd have believed it, wouldn't you? Yeah, you would. I'm going to do one more story, then I'm going to take a break. I'm a bit croaky tonight. I'm going to get Kenny to sing a song. But the story that was, again, beautifully set up, Willy, thank you very much, was the story about a farmer. And this farmer had 3 sons. And always in Ireland, the eldest son always gets the farm. And this farmer had not benefited from that. His brother had taken the farm. It wasn't fair. So he decided he'd give his 3 sons absolutely an even chance of getting the farm. So he called them together and he said, boys, I want you to fill this house with one thing. Well, the oldest boy, his name was John. John looked around the farm, and the biggest thing they had in the farm was the big plough horse, big Clydesdale horse. Now, it took him quite an effort to get this horse in there. And it seemed to fill the whole house, but if you know anything about horses, there's spaces underneath, spaces up above. Wasn't going to work. So he had to get it out again, and he had to shovel out all that the horse had left behind as well. The second son was called James, and James looked around and he saw straw. There's plenty of straw. So he filled the whole house with straw. But again, if you know anything about hay and straw, it settles. And so there were gaps here and gaps there. It wasn't working. Well, the youngest one, I think his name probably was Kenny. Everybody looked and thought, if the other 2 can't do it, how's he going to do it? I mean, all that he was interested in was music, music, music. He was always off at sessions. He was playing in pubs, all over the place. So he came in with both arms the one length, as we'd say, carrying nothing. They all looked. But he went over to the fireplace, and he took down the fiddle, and he put it under his chin, and he picked up a bow, and he started to play. And he played jigs and reels and polkas and slow airs, and the music swirled up and filled every crevice in that whole cottage. And so it was he who won the farm. But of course he wasn't interested in farming, not at all. He let the two brothers farm the land, but the house he kept as a Cayley house, a session house, to do what we're doing here tonight, where people would gather, friends and strangers, not strangers for long gathering, for music and for stories and for songs. So I'm going to invite Kenny to come and do some music, and then I'll come up and tell you some more stories. Thank you very much for now.
Well, I was trying to decide what would be a good song, and Liz told that story about Donegal, and it decided me. Because there's a lovely old song written by Tommy Makem called The Boys of Killybegs. Killybegs is a small fishing village on the southern coast of Donegal. There are wild and rocky hills round the coast of Donegal, and the fishermen are hearty, brave and true, and the big Atlantic swell is a thing they know right well, as they strive to make their living from the sea, with the pleasant rolling sea and the heron running free. The fishing fleet is riding on the foam. When the boats are loaded down, they'll be singing in the town. The boys of Killybegs come rolling home. Now your rubber boots you've donned, and your oilskins you put on. You check your gear to see if it's okay, and your jumper keeps you warm, for it's cold before the dawn. And you're ready to begin another day, with the pleasant rolling sea and the heron running free. The fishing fleet is riding on the foam. When the boats are loaded down, they'll be singing in the town. The boys of Killybegs come rolling home. Now you're headed out to sea, and the wind is blowing free. You cast your nets as rain begins to fall, but the clouds may blow away, and you'll have a better day. Today maybe you'll have a bumper haul, with the pleasant rolling sea and the heron running free. The fishing fleet is riding on the foam. When the boats are loaded down, they'll be singing in the town. The boys of Killybegs come rolling home. Now the work is awful tough when the weather it gets rough, and the ropes bring out the welts upon your hand. But you'll never leave the sea, or wherever you may be. When it's in your blood, it's hard to stay on land. With the pleasant rolling sea and the heron running free, the fishing fleet is riding on the foam. When the boats are loaded down, there'll be singing in the town. The boys of Killybegs come rolling home. Now there's green along the bay, and there's purple in the hills, and the sun it paints its yellow on the foam. But it's silver down below, where the darling fishes go. If we catch them, then it's gold for you and me. With the pleasant rolling sea and the heron running free, the fishing fleet is riding on the foam. When the boats are loaded down, they'll be singing in the town. The boys at Killybegs come rolling home. With the pleasant rolling sea and the heron running free, the fishing fleet is riding on the foam. When the boats are loaded down, they'll be singing in the town. The boys at Killybegs come rolling home. Aye, the boys at Killybegs come rolling home. Thanks very much.
Perfect. That just reminded me of a story about a fisherman. First of all, how much do you know about Irish ghosts? Do you know much? Wee bit. Do you know about the banshee? Do you? The banshee is a fairy woman, and if you see her, nothing's going to happen to you, but somebody in your family or your neighbourhood is going to die. My first memory of her was from a film that many of you have seen called Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which I think is responsible for me being a storyteller, actually. I didn't grow up listening to traditional stories, but Darby O'Gill was, well, it scared the life out of me, put it that way. But the banshee has got some cousins. There's one called a Lananshee. And a Lananshee is a fairy lover. All she has to do is set her eye on a mortal man, and that's it, he's gone. History. Use any word you like, bewitched, enchanted, those sort of words. There's women like that, but this was the fairy kind. So I'm going to tell you the story of a young fisherman. His name was Randall. He was coming home over the cliff tops near Ballintoy in County Antrim, not far from where I live, when he was followed by a Lananshee, a fairy woman. She came after him, sighing and crying and tugging at his jacket, and he knew if he looked into her eyes even once, he'd be gone. But he stood stock still. She sighed and she cried, and he paid her no heed. And after a while, she moved off, and as he walked home, he saw her off to the side of the road, burying something under a tall standing stone. So he went home. He put salt in this pocket, iron in the other, that wards off enchantment, and he dug under the stone and pulled out a chest. When he opened the chest, it was full of gold, fairy gold. He took it home and he buried it under a rowan tree, for the rowan or the rowan tree is a magical tree. She couldn't touch it. Well, night after night, she came sighing and crying, banging on his windows. He thought, will she give me no peace? Maybe if I get married, she'll leave me in peace. Now, Randall was handsome, tall, black curly hair, long black lashes, broad shoulders, narrow waist. Young men like him were, and sadly still are, as rare as hen's teeth. All the girls were mad about him, and this one girl, Nancy, her father kept a pub. He liked her, she liked him, he proposed, she accepted, but of course he had to go and face the father. And the father said, you'll not marry him. All he's got's a scattering of old mountainy sheep and a thatched roof that wants mending, poor shelter in a winter's day. Randall mentioned the gold. Gold, the only gold that boy ever sees in the buttercups. But when he brought the chest and opened it up, the father's eyes came out in stalks. He said, listen, that's treasure trove. You could get into real trouble with that. I'll look after that. You marry my daughter. The match was made. They got married, and the first night he brought her home, she heard the wailing outside. What's that? Shh. Only the wind, love. Of course, she believed every word he told her. He always made sure the curtains were pulled at night. And when they were married about 6 months, Nancy's father took ill, and she had to go in and look after him. And one night, Randall came home from his work. It was a beautiful moonlit night, and he just slumped down in the armchair in front of the fire, fell asleep. But all of a sudden, he was jolted awake by a long, lonely cry, and when he looked out the window, what did he see looking back? but the beautiful face of the Lananshee. That was it, bewitched. He followed her off to the land of Fairy and stayed there with her for 7 long years, though to him it was just like one night. When he came back to his own house, he peeped in the window, and there was Nancy sitting by the fire. But wasn't she rocking a cradle? And there was another man in his seat. He walked in, he said, "Nancy, I'm home, love." She gave a cry. She said, "Get out of my house, old man." It's me, Randall, your husband." "Oh, no," she said. "Oh, my handsome young husband was drowned in the sea 7 years ago. I waited 5 years before I married John. Oh, if you could have seen my husband. So handsome, his beautiful black hair." And Randall looked up and looked into a mirror above the fire and saw indeed he was looking into an old man's face. His black hair had turned pure white. He had a haunted look in his eyes, lines etched in his face. And as he looked into that mirror, what did he see looking back? Reflected in the mirror, but the beautiful face of the Lananshee outside. He gave a cry and he ran from that house and was never seen again. As for the gold in the chest, when Nancy's father opened it, all there was a handful of copper beech leaves. For they say, it would be better for a man to be drowned in the sea than to look in the face of the Lananshee. For after that, there's nothing for him but wandering, wandering. For the face of the Lananshee is lovelier than a dream, and her song is lonelier than the seabird's call. I was telling stories once in Indianapolis, the Hoosier Festival, and a nun came up to me and she said, "Lots of people die in your stories." And I said, "Yeah, it's sort of an Irish thing, people die a lot." So I'm going to tell you something completely different, a bit of a joke really, because I would do a lot of work, as some people here know, in elder care, in nursing homes, and day centres, and there's always somebody that says, "Come here, daughter, come here." I call you daughter. "Come here, daughter, come on," even my age. And I go and I hear stories. So this is a story I heard from a lady who used to come to our storytelling groups, and I love it. Now, where I live in the top northeast corner of Ireland, only 14 miles from Scotland, which is why some people think you sound a bit Scottish. Well, we're closer to Scotland than we are to Belfast, And we have a lot of bachelor farmers. Women weren't too plentiful. They grew up on their farm and whatnot. So I'm going to tell you just a wee story about Willy. And this is one you can take away with you and tell. You can change the names and the venue. Willy was indeed a bachelor farmer, and his friends were always saying, "Would you not go out and get yourself a woman? Would you not get a wife? Your life would be easier." And to tell you the truth, as he got older, he thought maybe it would be. Maybe. Because a wee bit of comfort. So he announced this to his friends. He got them all cleaned up, shirt and tie, sent them off to the dance. Some of you are old enough to remember when the men would all be on one side, the women would be on the other, long walk across the floor. Girls would be saying, "Don't think much of the one you're getting." That sort of thing. You couldn't refuse them anyway. So he met this girl, and he danced every dance with her. Her name was Mary. And his friends were saying, "No, no, 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 no. She's a city girl. She's from Belfast. You don't want her. You want a big, strong, sonsy country woman who can milk the cows, feed the pigs." But he liked her. And so every weekend when she came down to stay with her granny, the two of them walked out together. That's what you call dating for you younger people in the olden days, walking out together. There were no cars, hardly a bicycle, but anyway, so they walked out together. And after many, 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 many months of courting, he plucked up every ounce of romanticism that he had. He was a typical Ulster man, and he said, "How would you like to be buried with my people?" Which is the best proposal you're going to get. So she said she would marry him, but she wanted a big day. Willy had no idea what a big day was, so he told her to organise it. She said, "Right, you organise the honeymoon." Did Willy know anything about honeymoons? He knew about full moons and crescent moons and harvest moons. And one night he was coming home in the tractor and he saw a low orangey coloured moon, and he thought that'll do it. So he did nothing. So they had the big day, and he could not wait to get home and get out of the shirt and tie and get into his overalls. He had the pigs to feed, he had the cow to milk, and she went to bed in a huff. She was really cross. So at the end of the day, when he'd all the work done, he changed into his new flannel striped pajamas. Don't know if anybody here remembers those. They were stripy and he usually had a cord belt around them anyway. So he went up to bed. He was exhausted. Don't worry, you have to trust me with the story. It's all right. He climbed into bed exhausted. He turned over to go to sleep and boom, she hit him a dig with her elbow and she said, "Willy, I'm cold." He got out of bed, he got a blanket, he tucked it in round her very carefully. Back into bed again, turned over, boom. "Willy, I'm still cold." This time he came down to the kitchen, filled the kettle, boiled the water, filled a hot water bottle, a jar as we call it. It was a stone hot water bottle, wrapped a towel around it, put it at her feet. What more could a woman want? Back into bed again. Boom. "Willy, I'm still cold. When I was cold in Belfast, my mother used to just get into bed beside me and put her arms around me and give me a big hug." He said, "Mary, I don't mind getting you the blanket, I don't mind getting you a hot water bottle, but if you think I'm driving to Belfast for your mother at this hour of the night, you have another thing coming." That's your story. That's what you call Irish country humour. Innocent. And that's the thing where people gather together to share stories. It's not competitive. Nobody's saying that story is better than that story, or I like that one better. When it gets a bit cutthroat like that, I just want to opt out. So I love hearing the stories from the older people that call me over and tell me the stories. Sometimes they're the little quiet voice that you have to really strain to hear. So I love those stories. And I want to tell you one that I'm particularly fond of. Again, I've been doing some work with a classical pianist called Anthony Caparelli, both Colin Irwin, who's another local storyteller, and myself. We've been doing stories, and Philip Hammond, a composer, composed the music, and Tony then has been playing this beautiful music to go with our stories. So you're going to hear the story without the music. You have to just imagine the music. Where I live, on that top northeast coast of Northern Ireland, there is an old graveyard. It's my favourite place to take guests. It's called Weir Church. And one day, I hope that's where I'll be scattered looking out at that view, but not yet. But the story I'm going to tell you comes from generations ago. And at that time, there was a great deal of travel between Ireland and Scotland, and the family names are often the same: Macaulay, McAllister, MacDonald. And the MacDonalds owned most of the land around there. And one of the young MacDonalds was down walking along the seashore on one moonlit night when he saw a beautiful young woman. He fell instantly in love with her, as they did at that time in stories, and they met night after night after night. And he discovered that she was the daughter of the Sea King. And after much wooing, she agreed to give up her life of immortality to live on the land with him. They were very happy. They had several children. But when the fourth child was born, she died of fever in childbirth. And he was heartbroken. And of course, they agreed that she would be buried in the MacDonald graveyard that sloped down to the sea. But the Sea King was horrified to think of his daughter trapped there on the earth. And so he commanded the white-toothed waves to gnaw at the shore, and they pulled the graveyard down under wave. But he made a promise to MacDonald's. If any of them died, they would carry the casket down to the shore and set it there, and his men would come and deliver it down to the graveyard under wave. And that happened for many generations. But there was a particularly good wake one night with a lot of whiskey, and a young man called Connor thought he'd test this out to see if this was true or not. And so he took himself off behind some rocks with a bottle of whiskey, and he waited. And he saw the men carry the black coffin down to the white shingle and set it on the shore. And he sat and watched as darkness came in and the moon rose high over the sea. And at that time he heard a murmuring, an incantation. And he saw 4 tall men rise and come out of the sea. They had long hair and they were muttering to each other. And he heard one say, "How long will this have to go on, that we bury the men of the land?" Another said, "As long as mortal ear can hear or mortal eye can see. If they see us, we will stop." And at that point, Connor just kicked a stone. 4 heads turned and saw him, and they lifted the coffin and took it down under the waves. No further coffins were ever lifted from that beach. But if you come to Ireland to this day, and you take a boat out round the north coast, and you look down through the grey, green, clear waters, you can see the headstones and the crosses of that graveyard under wave. Thank you. That's the sort of story I like. You know, every storyteller has the sort of stories that they like. And obviously you have to pick the right story for the right time and the right place. When I'm in church, I always think a story. Kenny did a course with me, and the first story I always usually tell in the course is a story about a young curate, a young minister who was sent to a church to stand in for an old man. And the old minister was away off on his holidays, and the young man knew this was his big chance. Sunday morning, it was a full church. And he worked on his sermon and worked on his sermon and worked on his sermon. And when Sunday morning came, the place was packed and he gave it all he had. Hellfire and damnation. And people were wringing his hand and thanking him, saying how good it was. And he felt good about himself. But when it came to Sunday evening, only one old man turned up, sat in the front seat. And the young fellow thought, well, I've got my sermon prepared. I'm going to go for it again. And he gave it everything he had. And the old man sat and looked at him. When he came down afterwards, the old man put out his hand, shook it, and wasn't saying anything. So the young curate said, can I just ask you, sir, what you thought of my sermon? Well, son, he said, it's like this. He said, I keep hens. When I go out with a bucket of meal to feed them, and only one hen comes, I don't give her the whole bucket. And that's how it is with storytelling, people. You don't necessarily have to always give the whole bucket. So that's one. So remember that. My 3 words that I always say is less is more sometimes. But the stories that draw me to them are usually fairly romantic. We've got Jean here, and Jean's a great friend of a friend of mine called Madeline McCulley, who'll probably be watching this online. And Madeline always asks me to tell this. Oh, she's saying hi to her. Saying hi to you, Madeline. Madeline always asks me to tell this story because if you leave Belfast, you drive over a place called the Glen Shean Pass. Usually we get a lot of snow there in the wintertime. And you come through a town called Dungiven. And as you go into Dungiven, there's one of those brown sort of signs from the Department of the Environment that says Dungiven Priory. And a priory is an old church building. And that's where this story I'm going to tell you starts and finishes. Many years ago, most of the land around Dungiven was owned by the O'Cahans. Nowadays, the name is O'Kane in English. It would be O'Cahan in Irish. But the O'Cahans owned all that land, and the family had big, strong sons, about 7 of them, but only one daughter, and she was very beautiful. Her name was Finvola, unusual name. Now, at that time, girls didn't get much of an education, but this girl was the apple of her father's eye. He sent her to the priory at Dungiven, and she was taught to read, she was taught to write. And at that time, there was a great deal of trade between Ireland and Scotland, and one day the whole family, including the girl, were sailing to Scotland when a big storm blew up, and their ship was wrecked on the shore in Scotland. They were half drowned coming out of the water, wondering how they'd ever get home. When coming towards them, they saw a ship rowed by Norsemen with helmets on their heads, and standing tall on the prow with a Fellmore plaid thrown over his shoulder was a young Highlander, Angus Og MacDonald. And he explained that his father was the Lord of the Isles, and he'd bring them back to the castle on Islay where they'd get hospitality. Well, they were grateful. And it took several weeks to have a ship made ready. And in that time, I'm sure you're guessing this already, Angus looked at Finvola and Finvola looked at Angus, and love blossomed between them. And so when the family came back to Ireland again, well, the O'Cahans, she brought Angus's heart with her, Finvola. He pursued her to Ireland. He begged her father for her hand in marriage. No, my daughter's not going to live in Scotland. No, my daughter's going to stay here. Oh, but Daddy, he's the man for me. And of course, he could deny her nothing. So he agreed that the two would be married on one condition, and that was if anything were to happen to Finvola, Angus must promise to bring her body back to Ireland for burial. What young couple ever think of death at a time like that? So they agreed. And they had a very good marriage, several children. But again, like the other story, she took ill after the birth of a child and she died. Happened a lot in those days. And Angus prepared for the funeral, and then suddenly it struck him his promise. How could he send her body back to Ireland for burial? How could he do that? No, she'd stay there where the family or the children could go and grieve at the graveside, say prayers. And sure, by the time the word reaches Ireland, who would know? Except the O'Cahans were one of those families who had a family banshee. The banshee tends to follow families with Mac or O. And the banshee, Gronero O'Cahan, cried 3 nights running from the hill above Dungiven. Everybody in the family heard her. So they went round, who's dead, who's being prayed for. Everybody was accounted for. There's only one person missing. And her father knew in his heart his daughter was dead, so he armed his men, set sail for Scotland to bring her body back by force. The Scots saw them coming. They armed themselves. They were going to fight for their Irish princess. But Angus was a man of honour. He said, no. She came to me in love, and in love I must return her. And so they loaded her body onto the ship. They sailed back to Ireland, and they buried her there at the Priory of Dungiven. So if you come over and you're going up and down that road between Belfast and Derry, take some time, stop off, go down there, and remember the story of Finvola O'Cahan, the gem of the row. Thank you. Time for two more stories. Somebody was saying to me, I do that week in Jonesboro in Tennessee that a lot of people do, and I managed to pack in more stories in an hour than an awful lot of people. I love little short, sharp stories. I grew up telling stories at a time when there was a lot of violence in Belfast, and we would be having our events and you'd hear sirens going off and this, so we tend to go quite fast. So I'm going to tell you 2 stories. One old, well, no, they're both quite old. One I mentioned today because I was in California for a month years ago in the Ink People Center for the Arts in Eureka, a storyteller in residence. And they took me out to the Indian reservation at Witchpeck. And all these children, I was saying to people today at the workshop, ran up to me and said, we're Irish, these beautiful children with their long black hair, because they'd intermarried years before when the Irish people came over to work on the railroad. And this teacher said to me, have you ever heard of a man called Samuel Lover? And I said, well, yes, I have a story in my CD that he collected, and I was going to tell it. She said he was a great, great whatever of mine. So I'm going to tell the story today. Now, my telling of it, I heard first, my version comes from a version I heard from the late Alice Kane, who was a storyteller from Belfast. She went off to Canada as a young girl, and she became children's librarian for the city of Toronto. And you maybe don't know, but I was children's librarian for the city of Belfast. And I always felt connected to her. And when she was an old lady in her late 80s, I finally got to meet her in Toronto. And she tapped me on the hand and she said, you're the one with the Irish voice, which I thought was the ultimate compliment. But anyway, here's the story. The story comes from Cong in County Mayo, which viewers and listeners may know was in The Quiet Man. If you remember, that was the setting for it. This is long before. There once was a beautiful lady who lived in a castle high up by a lake. She was engaged to be married to a king's son. But a month before the wedding, the young man was murdered and his body thrown into the waters near the castle. They say that young woman nearly went out of her mind with grief. She shut herself up in the castle and wasn't seen day in, day out, week in, week out. But there appeared about that time in the waters near the castle a strange fish, a white trout. Nobody had ever seen such a fish before, and they thought there must be some magic attached to it, so no hurt nor harm would be put on it. It swam there year in, year out, longer than the oldest people could remember. But there came to that country an army of strangers, determined to teach the people new ways. And one hard-hearted villain heard the story of the white trout and decided he'd catch it, cook it, and eat it for sport. He fished, and he fished, and he fished. Fish knew no harm. He drew her from the water, popped her in a pan, cooked it, flipped it over. No mark, no burn. Cooked it. Still no mark. "Perhaps you taste better than you look, my pretty." And he picked up a knife and plunged it into the fish, and the squeal that came out of that fish would make your blood run cold. And there rose up from the ground the most beautiful woman, in a long white dress, a crown on her head, and blood pumping from her arm. "Look where you cut me, you villain," she said. "Look where you cut me." "Lady," said, "I didn't know it was you. How did I know it was you? Put me back in the water where I belong. I'm waiting for my own true love. He's to come to me by water. If he comes while I'm gone, I'll turn you into a pinky and a little fish. You'll swim there as long as grass grows or water flows. But what could put me back in the water?" "But how can I put such—" But when he looked, the lady had vanished, and there, flapping helplessly, was the fish. He slipped it into the water, which ran red on account of the blood, and then it ran clear. And that fish was left to swim those waters. People say it's still there to this day. But as for that soldier, he was a changed man. Said that after that, well, he never again ate fish, not even on a Friday. And he prayed twice a day for the soul of the white trout. Okay. Well, I was doing a story in Seattle on Sunday, and it's my favorite story in the world, so the people that were there, sorry, you're going to have to hear it again. And I was thinking of what Willy said about the personal stories. I don't tend to tell personal stories, but I'm going to tell you this story, which isn't my story, it's my mother's story, and it's my favorite story in the whole world, so I'm going to tell it to you. And then I'm going to lie in a darkened room for a while. This story happened long before I was born. My father was a career soldier. He served from something like 1919 through to 1948. But in 1937, he, my mother, my sister, my two brothers went to India, Imperial India, the northwest frontier of India. It's now where they were as the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. They lived at a place called Rawalpindi, and they went up into the hills to Murray during the summertime. I listened to stories about mongoose, I listened to stories about snakes, and I thought, it's not fair. I never get anywhere, but I've made up for that since. But the story I love best is when they left India. They left India and boarded troop ships to return to Ireland, but the date was 1939, the month was September. And some of you people know what happened then. The Second World War broke out, and they were in the middle of the Indian Ocean in big white troop ships. So they put into Mombasa in East Africa to have camouflage paint put on the ships, and while the men were working away, the women and children had picnics on the beach with fresh coconut, white sand. Heard those stories. But my mother was worried because Keith, my brother, was only 2.5, and the life jackets they had for the children were too big for him. Her friend had a little baby, only 6 months old, and the baby obviously wasn't a proper life jacket for her. So my mother had an old Singer sewing machine, 1925, which I have now, and she made 2 life jackets for these children out of cork and nappies, diapers as you call them. And of course, nappies were made out of terry cloth in those days. So when they went back on the ships, our family were on a ship called Britannia. The other family were on a ship called the Yorkshire. There were other ships. It was a proper convoy. They went up through the Suez Canal, out through the Mediterranean, past Gibraltar, around the coast of Spain. And the ships were spread out, but they could see them in the distance, you know. And my brother was on the deck when he saw a torpedo shoot through the water and bang, hit the Yorkshire amidships, and it exploded and sank very quickly. Our family ship switched off all engines because the U-boat was underneath listening. Mommy said she stood there with her hat and her gloves holding the 3 children, thinking if these children go into the water, they're going to die of hypothermia. It was November by that stage. But of course, you see me here, you know they made it home. They made it back to Ireland. And Mommy said she stood in Jail Square in Armagh with all her army boxes around her, all her possessions. She said, if ever I get a roof over my head, I'm never leaving it again. And she stayed in her house until she was 92 years old. Very lucky. But at that time of the war, there was only one place to go and see the news. Some of you people know that. The cinema. Pathé News. And there on the screen, she saw survivors being brought from the Yorkshire. She knew her friend had drowned. Many friends had drowned. But there on the screen in front of her, she saw a man carrying a baby in a bundle. The little baby had survived in the life jacket that she made. So I grew up listening to that story. And then years passed, And when my mother was 90, there was a big event, World War II. What was it really like? One of those boys and their toys sort of nights where people dress up, you know, in uniform. There was, of course, lots of American servicemen, very popular. We had British, we had Italian, we had German. And I was emceeing. My daughter's a journalist. She was taking notes. We brought my mother. We plunked her there. She loved it. Men in uniform loved it. So everything was going grand. And then I said, any questions? I had a distinguished panel. Excuse me, said this very English voice. I thought, no, it's my mother. And she started asking questions. And my daughter's got the head down like this as well, because we thought mother's going to take over here. And then the BBC were there, and they said, who's this woman? And I'm saying, it's my mother, actually. Claire's going, it's my nanny. And they said, could we come? Could we come and interview her? Oh, yes, she said, yes. She had the tea and the cakes all ready. Nice man from the BBC. So they came and they interviewed her, and they put her on the internet. You can read her stories if you look up BBC, Nell Martin, Your Place and Mine. And they came, we put the stories went up on the internet, time passed, and there was an email, a message in from a Mrs. Olive James. She said, I was that baby. My mother was drowned, and I was rescued and brought to Bordeaux. And I was able to tell that to my mother shortly before she died. So I'll end this evening by saying, please keep telling these stories. They're so important. And I just thank you for the opportunity given to me to come and tell my stories to you. And thanks to Willy and thanks to Kenny. Thank you very much indeed.